So welcome everybody. I will try and manage the people entering as I go. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we are all meeting on today, obviously various traditional owners. If anybody feels happy to do so, feel free to pop it in the chat on which country you are on. I am on the country of the Bunurong people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people that might be joining us today. Welcome. Today's forum is being held online just so that we could capture a wider audience, and also, I think we've all gotten used to this online space. So we're going to run through some presentations today. We're going to have Rowan Ewing from Landcare Australia talking first, myself talking second, Declan McDonald talking third, and Oscar, hopefully he joins us soon, will be talking last. So I'm going to hand over to Rowan. I will stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, Rowan. And Rowan's going to talk to us a little bit about the background of why Landcare Australia have been delivering this program and how this fits into some of the bigger Landcare farming benchmarking program that's being run through Landcare Australia at the moment. Over to you, Rowan.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'm here on Wurundjeri country here in Brunswick in Melbourne, but happily been working across Bunurong, Wurundjeri and Wadawurrung country in and around Melbourne's food bowl. Actually won't have a presentation this morning. I'll try and keep this fairly short and sweet, and just give you all a bit of a background about how this project's come about, and lead you on to the experts who've been on the ground. And I've been happily out on site quite a few times with these guys as we've developed up a couple of methods for natural capital assessment, and a bit more of an idea about where we're looking to head with it. So for a bit of background, Landcare Australia started to get interested in natural capital, which I'm sure you're all aware is popping up in all sorts of different sectors, from ag sectors, from local regions, from CMAs, through to the NFF. And it's really great to have Oscar Pearse here today to talk into some more bigger picture about where the Farmers Federation is seeing natural capital heading. But we initially got a very small seed grant from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation a year or so ago, and we brought through a few people from the Landcare community here in Melbourne, and from councils as well as NRM regions, and quite a few Landcare Australia staff together to run a workshop with Accounting for Nature to try and get a better understanding for what natural capital assessment, and in particular how you can account for that, means, and then how we can try and translate that to support producers and Landcare groups on the ground to engage with it and see where it can go to, because there's a lot of potential, and we're really seeing that overseas, particularly from the States and Europe, around stewardship payments and recognition of that incredible value of biodiversity and well-managed country that is on private land in particular, and what sort of support mechanisms can be put in place to help farmers and producers to access funding for doing the good work that they've always done in terms of caring for our collective assets, which is natural capital. Everything from soils to vegetation to habitat for common species, through to water quality, and all of those values which not only produce the food we all need, but support biodiversity right across the country and the planet. So we had that initial meeting, and we had, as I said, quite a range of people there. What it's led to is 3 pilot sites in and around Port Phillip, which Karen and Declan will speak to a bit more detail, but also it's led to a relationship with Accounting for Nature in terms of developing up a method which enables people on the ground, rather than experts. So we're really looking for something that was entry level for producers or land carers who, they know what's on the ground, they know what the weeds are and the local species, and they're interested in managing an aspect of the land, be it productive land or be that biodiversity focused, or a mix of the two, and trying to work out how to demonstrate what's there, but also demonstrate good practice to others in a simple format, which is a real challenge for Accounting for Nature. There's a whole lot of programs out there at the moment being driven by scientists that have a really in-depth understanding of what good and bad looks like, but it's very, very expensive to get those people out on site to tell you what's there. and it takes a long time to turn around, and then turning that into a simple message again becomes really complicated. So Landcare Australia, and particularly through our Landcare farming program, are trying to come at it from the other end, which is producer-led, and having people on the ground that can do these assessments themselves in a consistent and robust method, and we can turn those assessments into something meaningful, not only to the property, but also to whatever that local industry might be, if industries want to come together, or what that might mean to something broader like dairy or cotton or rice or grazing rangelands. So there's a whole lot of different scales where we see some simple on-farm assessments that can be scaled right up to a national set of accounts, which can then go back through to the federal government or can go through to investment level opportunities. So really, I'll pass back over to Karen in a second, but where we see this is it's really important that producers and people who are caring for the land have an ability to really show that positive impact that they're having on the landscape, because they've been toiling away at it for decades and have always struggled for recognition for that good work. And we see natural capital, and particularly producer-led or practitioner-led accounting that's simple, easy, consistent and transparent, and as a real opportunity for the Landcare and the Landcare farming community, more specifically, to demonstrate those skills. At the end, we're going to have a bit of a panel session, and so people can jump in and ask questions, and we'll respond to it, but that's by way of an introduction. So I might just hand back to Karen, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Rowan. So I'm going to share my screen in a second and just run through my presentation. I think it will be easier if we hold questions off until the end. So if you can just hold off with your questions. Any particular questions that you'd like to have written down, feel free to use the chat, and we'll manage the chat at the panel session at the end with the presenters and make sure that we're answering those questions through the chat as well. So I'm also going to try and keep managing to let people in through the waiting room. Anybody that's got their phone off mute, can you just mute your phone, your line, please, just to make it a little bit easier. And I'm just going to share my screen. So let me know when you can see my screen. Someone give me the thumbs up. No thumbs up. Can people see my, oh, sorry. Try now. Can people see my screen? Is that a thumbs up from anybody? Yep, awesome. Thank you very much, because you'll disappear off my screen. So you're in a little box in the corner. Thank you for that. So I'm just going to run through my presentation. Just going to remind people to make sure they're muted. All right, so like Rowan was sort of outlining, what we did with this particular project is we are trialling the accounting for nature methods, the level 3 methods for assessing native vegetation and soils on farms. Declan will go through the soils aspects of it shortly. So Declan's actually generated a whole method around soil accounting, which has been fabulous. So we don't have all the answers as yet. We've just been trialing this and making sure that the methods were effective on ground. We could actually use them on ground when we're working with farms and landholders, and that it was at a level where any producer or land carer would be able to utilise the method themselves. We didn't want it to be too complicated. So we were just giving this a trial and seeing and making sure that it could work. We have already fed back a number of suggestions back to Accounting for Nature on things that we found didn't work out in the field in particular. That was quite specifically around grasslands, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. And those changes have already been made by Accounting for Nature. So anyone that's been looking at that information will notice that it's gone from version 3 to a version 4, and version 4 has a number of updates in it that we provided feedback on back to Accounting for Nature. All right, so for those people that haven't really heard too much about what the Accounting for Nature framework is, as sort of Rowan was outlining too, it's a way of measuring the condition of environmental assets on a farm, such as native vegetation, maybe long-term waterways, soils and fauna at a property scale. So the idea is that the framework complements standards and certification systems such as your carbon offsets, those people that are involved in programs such as Fresh Care and Entwine and some of those other environmental assurance programs. And I guess it's a process that's designed to ensure some integrity and transparency of the condition of the environment on your property. I've got somebody that's not on mute. Make sure you mute yourselves. And I'm also just going to admit more people. So the Accounting for Nature has two indexes. One is the ECOND, which is the environmental condition of an asset, and the PCOND, which is what Declan will talk about, which is the productive condition of your asset, and that's obviously the soils based. So for my presentation, I'm focusing on the ECOND. Right, there we go. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the three landholders that have been involved in this trial with us, we've got Sharky Farm over in Ballyang East, which is, for those people that are not local, is located over here between Little River and Balan. We've also got Domain Shandon, which is over here in Coldstream in the Yarra Valley. And then we've got Barragunda Farm down here at Cape Shank. So they're the three properties that were involved in this program and offered a range of soil types, landscape conditions, and farm enterprises for us to trial this method on. So some of these slides might be a little bit small, but you will get access to them later on. I was trying to just sort of snip out of websites and things like that just to make it a little bit easier to than retyping things. Okay, so Accounting for Nature has three different levels. So level one is the type of level you'd go for if you're looking to access the environmental markets. Level two might be a level that you use to look to justify your public sustainability credentials. Level three is the Landcare level, and it's understanding environmental change over time. This is the level that we have focused on in this project. So the level three ECOND and the level three PCOND. So as though that little shot underneath, it's a little bit blurry. I have provided the link later on in the presentation, which you can all access. When I'm not talking later on, I may put some links in the chat for people to be able to access as well. So with the, in Victoria here, we've got the level three Accounting for Nature methods approved, and you can see this one down here, which is the Accounting for Nature method. We did also use habitat hectares as the one of our initial assessments, and we used that at Domain Shandon. Very complicated method for people that are aware of it and have used it before. And since then, Accounting for Nature have brought out their own method, which is the one that we then trialled at Barragunda in Cape Shank and Sharky Farm out in Ballyang East. Much simpler method to be using. So that's the one we're probably going with. But that's the one that's also approved for use here in Victoria. So that's what I'm going to focus on for this presentation, is the Accounting for Nature method. And Accounting for Nature also now have a method for level three for soils as well. For some reason my computer there we go. Taking a little while to flick slides. So as you can see, this is the updated Accounting for Nature website. We've got the native vegetation method available. So you can click here at the end, which will open up the actual method. And the soils method is now available as well, which is the method that Declan will take you through later on, and the method that he developed with Landcare Australia to be approved, which was approved in February for the Accounting for Nature as an approved method. So that's also now publicly available. This is the link here. I will put it up in the chat later on for people to access, but you can also go straight to the Accounting for Nature website and have a look, and you can download the methods from there directly as well. Okay, so like I said, level three native vegetation method is really just intended to be a tool to support farmers and land managers to measure the condition and track change over time in the environmental condition of native vegetation on their farm. So that includes both restored and rehabilitated areas as well as remnant vegetation. And like I said, we trialled this method and gave it a go on properties across those three sites across our region, and provided feedback to Accounting for Nature on how well these methods work at the Landcare level. So I guess just quickly going to go through some of the processes involved in this level three method, just to sort of show people what's involved and how accessible the information is for anybody to be able to access. So to begin with, you obviously need to have a reference benchmark. So what was the condition of the environment before settlement? And obviously here in Victoria, we're looking at bioregion, ecological vegetation classes, and we also look at land use for the accounting area. And these things get produced as maps as part of your accounting accreditation, if you like. So in Victoria, we've got a number of sites that you might be able to utilise to access this information, and there's those links up there. Personally, I use Visualising Victoria's Biodiversity. I find it just a much more simple site to use than NatureKick, but you didn't hear me say that. And obviously the EVC benchmarks are on the DELP website as well. So that's the type of sites you would go to actually obtain this information. People that are active in the Landcare community will already know this off the top of their heads. So that's why it's fairly easy and accessible to get this information. Some of the little things that I thought I'd just bring attention to is, people want to know when they're doing an assessment on their farm, how many sites they might need to run the assessment on. So you need to do one sample point per 5 hectares of your assessment unit. So that assessment unit might be a patch of remnant vegetation. It might be a shelter belt, an area that you've rehabilitated. So one assessment per 5 hectares and up to a maximum of 10 samples taken per assessment unit. And the other thing I'm just going to bring attention to is, which we learned when we did the assessment out in the grasslands, is to make sure you don't have that edge effect. So one of the measures you have to take, you actually have to step 10 steps outside of one of your star pickets. And of course, that put us on a farm track. So that was one thing we learned, is to read the instructions first, a bit like an IKEA manual. Read all your instructions first before you get started. So like I said, the type of data that you've got to collect, and I use mapping in Google My Maps. So, I've obviously got access to things like GIS mapping systems and pretty fancy software packages to do mapping. But I wanted to look at this from, anybody that's jumping onto their computer and wanting to use this information and develop their own maps. So I looked at a simplified method, which I actually learned from Ron Sawyer. And that is using Google My Maps to do the mapping. So I'm just going to quickly show you some maps in a minute that I did for 2 of the properties and how quick and easy it can be to put those together. So the information that you obviously need around your reference benchmarks is things like the extent. So we assume that the extent of vegetation on your assessment area pre-settlement is 100% because we don't have any land clearing or any other land uses for that area before settlement. So that's becomes an extent of 100%. And then we use the mapping to try and work out what the current condition or current extent of that area might be. And so that's done through a 1 kilometre radius, which I'll show you the map in a minute on how to do that, so that you can do it from just a My Maps. Then you've got the photo points and the field measurements that you need to go and collect. So this is the activity part, if you like, of what you would go out and do now to collect your data of what the present condition of that assessment area is. So that's what I'm pretty much going to go through throughout most of the presentation from now on, is just what these field measurements are and how you go about taking some of those measurements. So this is a Google My Maps that I've taken. So this is the property down at Cape Shank. And all I did was hand draw a polygon around the vegetation area that you've got in your assessment. So that's just one of the EVCs. So you can see here, it's EVC 858. And it's 148 hectares of native vegetation through here that we can use for this assessment area. So in reality, that would be 10 field assessments as the maximum because it's quite a large area. So we only did the one, which is just in here. Just as I said, we were testing the method. So in reality, you would go and actually do 10 assessments for that whole native vegetation area down there. And likewise, there's another patch on the farm here of riparian vegetation, which is a different EVC. That's just over 7.6 hectares. So that would be 2 field assessments. So I can literally get this data in terms of the hectares as soon as I've quickly drawn a polygon around that area in My Maps. So it's quite easy and quick to get that information. This is that 1 kilometre radius that I was talking about to get the present extent. So I've done this where, this is this point here, drawn this point here. In My Maps, you can use the ruler, which is, I think, one of the little tools up here. And I drew a 1 kilometre line out there. And so then you start looking at the radius around that assessment area. and then you can work out what percentage of that is remaining native vegetation, and that gives you the current extent of native vegetation against the benchmark, which was obviously uncleared. So it's pretty easy to collect this information online. Another quick example here is out at Ballyang East. We have an EVC of 5562, very special EVC out there. And again, the extent of the assessment area, I just drew a polygon around it, and it's just over a hectare. So we would only need to do one field assessment for this area, which we did, which these are our points in here. So when you're getting started, the first few things you need to do if you are going to do this level 3 accounting for nature method is select the area on your farm that you're going to use as your assessment area. That could be a shelter belt, patch of remnant, or a revegetated area. You do it by EVC as well, so that you obviously have different EVCs, so they're going to have different reference benchmarks. So you do have to map according to your EVC area as well. So, you know, if you've got 2 patches of remnant vegetation on your farm, but one's similar to Barragunda down there, one's riparian and one's more inland, they're 2 different EVCs. So you've actually got they're treated as separate assessment units. So you need to collect all of your reference benchmarking data, which I've just shown you, quick websites and mapping that you can do to collect all of that data, and draw the polygons around your assessment areas. So that's all the background information that you need to collect as part of your level 3 method. The next bit is the fun bit, which is going out and setting up your photo points in the field. And that's literally just a case of having a star picket for your north and south, and those are 10 meters apart. And then a meter in from those, you put a stake. And then you take your photo points, which is outlined in detail in the method on how to do your photo points for each of those stakes. And that's basically becomes your quadrant area for taking your field measurements. So it's just, you know, it's probably a 20-minute process to get your stakes in the ground and measure it all out. And then you go through the method, which is taking all of your field measurements. So I'm not going to go through that in great detail, but it is in the method, and it's got Appendix D. Some of the recommendations I would make, though, is to have things like the app called Seek iNaturalist. So if you're wanting to do some very basic identification, you don't need huge identification skills for this, but you do need to know what's native, what's not native, and what's a perennial native grass. So there's some of the basic identification skills you would need. But Seek iNaturalist is a really handy one to help you with some of those identifications. If you've got a local field guidebook, that can also obviously be really handy as well for just some of that basic identification for things that you're not sure of, if it's native or non-native. And obviously take photos if you want to go back to a computer afterwards that you've been in the field and just identify to make sure that you've got those things as accurate as possible. Certainly for our region, we are looking at putting together some specialised recording sheets to make it easy to go out and do your field data collection. There wasn't sort of many for us to go to, so we were literally writing notes as we were out in the field collection, doing our field collection. So we'll make sure that we've got some relevant data sheets for people in our region to be able to use and download to just literally go out into the field and take their measurements, and we'll have done the templates for you. And we're also looking at putting together a specific manual for this region as well, just to help bring it down to a much more sort of regional level. So once you've done all of your field measurements, like I said, you know, they're relatively easy. You can go into the method to have a look at what those particular measurements are. It's stepping things out and looking for perennial grasses, ground cover, canopy cover, height of your canopy trees, quite simple measurements that you take out in the field. The scoring part of it is a little more complex at the moment. So it does require a more qualified person in sort of local flora or ecology to complete this section. You can certainly give it a go yourself. I've done it myself and muddled my way through. But and I think our long-term goal would be that we would have people within the Landcare community have developed this expert level with accounting for nature, that they could actually do a lot of the scoring for people. And likewise, you know, once you've developed a fair bit of experience in this, like, it is relatively straightforward, although it's complex. And once you've done it a few times, it actually does become quite easy to do. So once you've taken your field measurements, you can do the scoring side of things. And again, there is templates available for the scoring. And that does also have all of the formulas embedded in it as well. So there's some formulas to help calculate your econ. those are already embedded in the template, so you don't have to touch them. Once you put your benchmarking figures in and the figures you've taken out in the field, it does all these automatic on calculations for you. So just quickly sort of getting over onto what the econd is about. So the econd is an index between 1 and 100, where an econd of 100 would describe the ideal or undisturbed reference condition of the asset. So obviously what it would look like pre-settlement, pre-weeds. And obviously 0 is an indicator of a completely degraded environmental asset. So again, if these are a bit small, you'll be able to see them in my presentation afterwards. So this is the template that you use to input your data. So if you can just see here, this column here, this is all the reference benchmarking data that you've collected on the computer. And then these are your scores for the field measurements that you've taken. Like I said, this end of it, it automatically calculates, so you don't need to actually touch anything in this side of the template. And as you can see, so this is just the real assessment that we did out at Barragunda here. So for this, the assessment econ is 45.1 out of 100 is the econ score that we got for Barragunda out there. And likewise for out in Ballyang East, this one hopefully is a little bit bigger. You can see the reference benchmarking data here that we've taken, and then we've taken the average measures through here, which are the field measurements that we took. And like I said, it automatically populates, and we get 44.8 out of 100 for that one assessment that we did out at Ballyang. Now for that assessment area, you remember, was just on a hectare, so we actually only need to do one assessment. So for that particular asset area, it has an econ of 44.8 for that one out there. There's some of the little tricky things that we do have here in Victoria is that we don't measure sub-canopy height. So we've had to have some things changed in the template by Accounting for Nature to allow us to be able to put NA in, or because 0 actually skews your data and your scores. So there's a few things where we've had to initiate some changes so that we could account for some of those things. Likewise, over in areas like Ballyang, where it's a grasslands, it was also accounting for the fact that there'd be a shrub layer. But we all know that majority of grasslands can often be treeless, but they're also often shrubless. So they might have scattered trees and then they're a grassland. So some of the formulas had to be adapted as well to enable us to use them in grasslands. So you'll see that the difference between version 3 of the method that was out before and the one that's out now, version 4, is there's actually calculations for working within grassland communities. And I guess, here's some of the so what. So, we know that the econ reflects the present condition from pre-settlement condition, but we're not always trying to restore land to a pre-settlement condition. So we shouldn't be trying to aim for, that necessarily that 100 out of 100. But what the idea is that landholders can use these scores to consider their management options that they might be wanting to implement to improve the condition of that assessment area over time, and demonstrate the trends that are leading to that improvement over time as well. So that, would be the main goal there. Yeah, and obviously there's, then there's the opportunities for the evidence-based eco-credentials and incentive markets, and where they have expectations on what, your econ scores either should be or what you should be aiming for. So for example, when you've got econ scores, say in the mid to high 40s, you might say, a landholder might turn around and say, okay, over the next 5 years, I'm aiming to get this to 55 or 60. So what do I need to do to manage this asset area, this assessment area, to get that econ score on an upward trend over the next couple of years? So that's what the idea behind those econs are. So I've gone through some of our observations on the method. So like I said, you set up your photo points and gather your benchmarking data. When you go through the method with the handouts and the templates that we have available, it's quite easy to follow. My recommendation would be to leave your photo point stakes in position over subsequent years so that you're not going back to try and GPS mark them and put them back in. As I said, read your photo point instructions before you begin so that you don't have that edge effect. If you've got someone with you that can identify weeds and perennial native grasses, or have some sort of field guide or app like that iNaturalist app, have those things available, which will just make it a little bit quicker as well. Don't stress too much about the scoring side of things. like I said, I muddled my way through using those templates and figuring it out which formula talked to which bit and how it all worked together. So with a bit of practice, it's quite easy, I think, for everybody to be able to take up. But in the meantime, there's people like myself and others in the Landcare community that are hoping to become accredited experts with accounting for nature. And that would make us available to support landholders to help with that scoring side of things initially. And like I said, Accounting for Nature have been great. They have updated the method using some of the suggestions that we've ground truthed for them at these trial sites, which was the main purpose of what we were trying to do. So that's been excellent. Almost finished, folks. So what might be this for me? So this is about tracking the trends for your soil and biodiversity. You might want to be able to adjust or maintain management practices according to the trends. So in particular, through drought years, if you can demonstrate through drought years that you don't have an econ that's going backwards, then you know that the sorts of things that you're doing to manage that assessment area is positive despite drought. So that would be one thing that I could see where some of these things could be advantageous as well. We're going to talk a little bit later about the future incentive schemes and some of the schemes that are out there, and the opportunities that farmers may have to enter into some of those schemes as they emerge in the next few years. Like Rowan said at the start, we're also part of the broader Landcare farming benchmarking project, and I think Mick's here today as well. So we're part of that broader scale project that you may be seeing advertised, or you may be part of an expression of interest process with your Landcare group or farming group. And we feed into that. We will develop a regional specific handbook on these methods so that it's regionally specific to Port Phillip and Westernport region, and develop up a few case studies around what we've learned and what we've done at these 3 farms so that other farmers can utilise that information. And just finishing off, this is specific to Port Phillip and Westernport region, but if we do have landholders that are interested in sitting down in a small group, I've got a small group down at Cape Schanck in April, and we are sitting down with laptops and tablets and iPhones, and we're going to sit down as a small group, and everybody will work on an assessment area for their farm, gather their benchmarking data. We're then going to go out into the native vegetation and set up a photo point and go through the field measurements so that everybody knows how to do it, and then go back to their own farm and be able to do it quite easily. And then I'll support them afterwards with the scoring side of things. So likewise, I'm happy to do that for at least one or two other areas in the Port Phillip Westernport region as well. So if we do have a small group of landholders that are interested, you just need to contact me, and we'll initiate something. So I've just put the commitment up there. It's just an approximate thing based on what we're doing down at Cape Schanck. Like I said, we'll sit down in the shed for about 2.5 hours, make sure you've grabbed all of your assessment data and done your mapping. We will go out and do a field measurement and set up photo points. And then for those that really want to actually get involved and learn to do their own econ scoring, we could go back and sit down again at a later date when you've collected your field measurements and actually work out some econ scoring for that assessment area that you've done. So this one's just obviously relevant links. So when you get my presentation at the end, you'll be able to look up some of the links and websites that I use to grab the benchmarking data for these trial sites. And there's my contact details for anybody that needs to or wants to get in touch with me if they're interested in being in a small group or have any questions afterwards. So I'm going to unshare my screen. And I'm going to also I'm also letting people into the waiting room that I've just noticed are sitting there.
Karen, on the assessment, I noticed that there were a couple of elements where the current situation had a higher score than the benchmark. Can you explain why that was downgraded rather than given 100%?
So things like, I'm sort of thinking, I know for Barragunda, I think their shrub layer, it's quite shrubbier than it used to be down at there on the benchmark for the EVC. So I guess in some ways that can be considered, I guess a negative. in terms of the condition in reference back to the original condition of that environment. The one that I found stuck out for me across, I think it's all 3 sites, is the litter. So that's referred to as sort of ground cover. I know Declan looks at ground cover quite differently, but in terms of the econ, ground cover is just the litter coverage. And at all 3 sites, there's more litter now than there was in the original EVCs. Now, and in some ways, depending on, if you're looking at this from a farming perspective, you would say, well, extra ground cover or litter is probably a good thing. When you're going down the pathway of regen ag and having 100% ground cover. So it is an interesting one about whether or not that's positive or negative in terms of what an assessment area looks like now. Is it good to have more litter, or is it bad to have more litter? So I don't probably have all the answers to that yet. Rowan might have some things that he can shine on that.
Yeah, sure. I think you're basically on point, though. It's sometimes too much of a good thing stops being a good thing. So that's why some of those, particularly, and it's consistent with the habitat hectares method as well. It's where, for example, there's too much ground cover, too much organic litter might then be preventing recruitment of new herbs and ground species. So there's a threshold where you want enough cover, and when suddenly you have too much, that becomes an inhibitor to recruitment of particularly annual species that you may be interested in for biodiversity. Again, it could be it is almost always a sign of a lack of disturbance. So sometimes you do want stock or high numbers of herbivory, or maybe you want a certain number of logs so that you can have habitat for things that like to live in logs, but too much can also become an increased fire risk and or preventing that recruitment. That's particularly looking at ground cover, but again, post-disturbance, you'll also see a lot of shrubs coming up, and that will also be inhibiting recruitment of other species. So a benchmark is it's a scientist-driven ideal of what that vegetation community will look like. But obviously there's variance across the board, and depending on a local disturbance regime, be that nutrient change, be that grazing management, be it bushfire, flooding, whatever it is, it's all working towards that one ideal, which may not be the ideal for your property or your catchment. And so that's where this method's actually really good, is you can state what that ideal is and why. And the real transparent way that around accounting for nature supports that. So that's why we think it's a really good method.
Thanks, Rowan. I'm going to hand over to Declan now, who's going to talk about the PECOND and measuring the soil condition on a farm and the level 3 method that he has developed. So over to you, Declan.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen. I'll start off by trying to share my screen. One there. Okay, hopefully you can all see that now. Can I get a thumbs up, Karen? Mm-hmm. Yep, got it, okay. So thanks very much for your presentation, Karen. You've really covered in quite a lot of detail the background to this, so I don't need to go into that again. So I'm just going to talk about the development of the soil method under this National Landcare Farming project. So this, as Karen said, this is a level 3 accounting system, which differs from, under the Accounting for Nature model, there's essentially 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. And one is the highest level, really, and probably the best known example of that is the federal government's emissions reduction fund CFI method for soil carbon accounting. And although that's separate to accounting for nature, that's the level of rigor, and that is quite a rigorous process that's required for a level 1. And the difference between levels 1, 2, and 3 are really about levels of scientific confidence that we have in the eventual score that we have. So with a level 1 method, we'd have a very high level of confidence that the result was accurate. Level 3, we have what's termed a reasonable level of confidence. Okay. So, yeah, I mentioned that level of confidence. So one of the things with the Accounting for Nature model, so when I started looking at this, I'm thinking, well, this is for agricultural land only. for productive land. So when I talk about productive land, I'm talking about agricultural productive land as opposed to naturally productive land in a natural ecosystem like Karen's been talking about. But accounting for nature, we're fairly keen for us to have reference values for what conditions were like before we started farming. That really just gives us if you like, a benchmark of where we have come from. Now, one of the interesting things here, of course, is that when we're changing land use to, say, growing potatoes from native bush, we're going to be moving potentially a long way from what those original native conditions might be. As an example, a lot of potato growing soils, and I use that because a lot of potato growing soils are some of those rich red ferrosols that you might be aware of around places like Thorpedale and Ballarat. They're naturally very acidic, way too acidic to be growing potatoes, for example, or other vegetables. So we apply a lot of lime to those soils to sweeten them up, but in so doing, move quite a way away from that original reference condition. But the reference value is there as if you like, a point in time that tells us why we are as far away now as we are, and also how well it compares to industry values. And when we talk about industry values, we're talking about really agronomic best practice. So for example, you know that we generally say that pH of a soil should be between about 5.5 and 7.5, depending on where you are and depending a bit on what you're growing. And these values have been developed over many, many years of research and many different types of crops and many different soils right across the country. So they're very generic. And in some places, the native conditions aren't going to fit that. And in some places, the native conditions, for example, you know, out in the Western Division, many of those soils are quite alkaline. That might be more alkaline at 7.5, and it might cost a lot of money to bring them back into this, you know, ideal range. So this is the challenge. We're trying to develop a one-size-fits-all. There will be outliers, but as Karen was saying, the main purpose of this entire approach is to give individual landholders a measure of where their soils sit relative to industry benchmarks and where they would like them to be, and provides a rigorous method to monitor change over time. So the primary determinant that we start with is the soil order, and soil order is, if you like, just another word for soil type. So under the Australian soil classification, we've got fancy words like ferrosol and sodasol and podsol and the like. But you might know your soil by more local language. So people might talk more locally about red-brown earths or black earths, or you know, there's a whole range of local names. But so long as that local name is able to distinguish what's different about that soil and to say that that soil is that type of soil, that's fine. And then once we have soil order identified, then we need we wanted to look at what are some core soil properties that we're going to use that are best, that are the best measures to help us monitor change in soil condition over time. Now, the brief at the start of this exercise was that this really needed to be as user-friendly as possible and also cost-effective. So we could load this up and have lots of different soil properties, which would give us a higher degree of confidence, and we would see, you know, there's lots of different moving parts in a soil. So for example, we could monitor nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur and calcium and magnesium and all of these different things that are worth looking at, but that may all add to the expense of it. And some of those measures are going to tell us more about changes in soil condition and responses to management practices than others. So we've focused in on a small number of core soil properties. And I'll come to those in just a sec. So part of in deciding how we're going to apply this on land, we want to identify, you know, there may be just one soil order across our entire farm, or there may be a number of soil orders across our farm. So the first thing to do is to identify where are the different soil types on your farm. So we might have, alluvial flats, we might have hill rises, we might have, heavy clays on the flats, we might have sandy, gravelly material on the rises or whatever. So we really want to separate out these discrete areas and say, okay, these are going to be individual assessment units. Because I'm not going to sample, I'm not going to run a transect between a clay flat and a stony rise, for example, because I'm going to be, I'm going to have a mongrel of a result, and then my management actions as determined by soil testing are going to be a bit all over the place. So we want our management actions to be specific to each of our assessment units. What do our clay soils need? What do our sandy soils need? What do our loamy soils need? So when we have those areas identified, then we determine where we're going to locate our transect. Now, you can see here on this aerial shot of Barragunda Farm, we've established the start and the end of the transect across this single land assessment area, which is primarily a sandy loam to loamy sand type of topsoil. Establishing the transect here in Ballyang, this is on Chris Sharkey's property, and a canola crop. And we're running a 100-metre transect out. To the degree possible, we want to really run these out along the contour if we can, and that is to avoid significant changes in, say, soil depth as we go up or down hills and that type of thing. And here at Domain Shandon in the Yarra Valley, we selected transects running along vine rows. So the sampling plan itself, we're looking at 1 sample per 10 hectares, and that's really quite a big area, and it can be less. So if you have a whole bunch of 2 hectare or 5 hectare paddocks on your farm, and you choose to manage your farm based on your paddock size, that is completely fine. And in fact, obviously the smaller unit that you're managing and testing, the more information you have and the better able you are to manage that. But we said we're going to have a 10 hectare optimal block, bearing in mind that this system is designed to work across Australia, across huge properties and small. And similarly, if somebody's got 10,000 hectares of wheat and they've got 2 soil types on that, then this can be amended as appropriate. And again, as Karen was saying, this is around returning information back to the landholder. We want to establish georeferent transects of 100 metres. Along that 100-metre transect, we'll take 10 subsamples at 10-metre intervals, and we will bulk those samples at the end and draw off then a single sample for laboratory testing. And whenever you're doing any kind of soil testing, there should always be a minimum of 10 samples taken from across the area, bulked, mixed together thoroughly, and then drawn off. And what that means is you then have a sample that is truly representative of the area, as opposed to walking out into the middle of the field, taking a single soil sample and saying, that's representative of the paddock. Well, a cow may have defecated there, 3 months ago. An animal might have died there a year ago. Conditions at that spot are going to be very different. So by taking subsamples, we iron out lumpiness in a paddock like that. We want to avoid areas that have been fertilized within 3 months, or ideally, we say within 3 months, and that's assuming rain since the fertilizing. Because obviously, if a lot of fertilizer has been thrown out, and we go out and we sample, not too long after, we're going to get inaccurate results. And ground cover is one of our measures, and that is monitored via remote sensing. So these are our core soil properties that we are using to give us a minimum set of highly reliable indicators that are going to be responsive to land management. Soil pH, electrical conductivity, and you might kind of think of electrical conductivity more in terms of salinity. Soil organic carbon, extractable phosphorus, and we're using Olsen P as a more universal phosphorus extraction method to give us that national consistency, and ground cover. And these measures are consistent with national soil matters for target, which were developed with enormous input from the soil science community over the last number of years. And those national soil matters for target are pH, organic carbon, erosion by wind, and erosion by water. The ground cover measure is really useful to help as a, if you like, a surrogate for erosion. Obviously, if we have high ground cover, we have low risk of erosion. If we have low ground cover, we have significant risk of erosion. Okay, so I'm going to get, I've really tried to simplify this as much as possible now, but bear with me and hopefully we'll get there. So our system looks at measurement of these 5 properties: soil pH, EC, organic carbon, extractable phosphorus, and ground cover. For the range of conditions across Australia are going to be covered by the soil order, the land use category, that is what you're doing with the land, are you a cropper, a grazer, perennial hort, whatever, the depth from which the sample is being taken, the annual rainfall. So we obviously wanted to have some kind of discrimination between, say, southern Victorian high rainfall zone and the Mallee and further afield. And then we wanted to have the reference value for the econd. And the econd is really what Karen was talking about, getting that measure of what the original environmental condition was that gives us a benchmark for comparison. And then the reference value for the pcond, and that's going to relate to the industry best practice benchmarks. Yeah, okay, I'll continue. So let me just pull out a few of these to give you an example of what that actually looks like. So if I just look at soil pH, and the measure here is 1 to 5 in water, which is the standard to measure soil pH in laboratory testing. We say soil orders all, so it means doesn't matter whether you're on a sandy soil, clay soil, whatever, this soil pH, these measures are going to apply irrespective of what soil you've got. And also pretty much covers off pastures, cropping, and horticulture as well. The depth we're looking at here is the top 10 centimeters. Annual rainfall, again, or whether it's dry land, whether it's high rainfall zone, low rainfall zone, doesn't matter. These are the measures for soil pH. Now, reference value for econd, and I've put here TBD, to be determined. And I'll come back to that in just a second. And then our reference value for the pcond, we've got 5.5 to 7.5. And as I mentioned before, these are the broad parameters that we say, well, within this pH range, we have conditions that suits the vast majority of crops that are grown, horticulture, food and fiber crops across the country. Just coming back to this reference value for the econd, we're going to be quite challenged in some landscapes to know what the original pH might have been before we came along and cleared it. But there's a few ways we can figure out what this might be. One is there's very often the small remnant patches of bushland, and this is where roadside vegetation often is really significant because it gives us a window into the past to tell us what conditions may have been before we came along and changed everything. A lot of the time, these areas weren't grazed or were never grazed particularly heavily, and certainly were never fertilized. So we get an idea and have their standing native vegetation that's always been there. So these are really good indications of what conditions might have been. Failing that, we go to expert opinion, and we'll be looking to often departmental or university or Landcare resources to say, what access do we have to expert opinion to tell us what do we know about this area? What can we deduce about this area, potentially even based on similar areas in similar environmental zones? So this will need to be figured out, possibly with the assistance of others, but in the method we have identified resources where you can go, online resources where you can go to start nutting out some of that information. But this is the main, and order are probably the two challenging parts of this. And again, the method specifies resources to help you with answering both of those questions. Just picking another one, extractable phosphorus. And as I said, we're using the Olsen P method. Many of you might have done phosphorus testing using the Colwell P method. They're not really, there's not an index that allows you to say, okay, if I've got a Colwell P of this, I've got an Olsen P of this. They're not directly comparable. So you would need to do a separate Olsen P test, but it's a pretty cheap test. Again, all soil orders, here, we've got a separate category for cropping under this, but I'm just not showing it here. Depth of 10 centimeters, rainfall here, there are different rainfall increments under this measure as detailed in the method. So there'll be a different level for high rainfall zone and low rainfall zone. Again, reference value would need to be determined. And the industry value is 10 to 23. This might seem quite precise, but this is based on primarily Victorian research that says below 10 parts per million, this is in milligrams per kilogram, below 10 milligrams per kilogram, production is likely to be suffering. Above 23 milligrams per kilogram, you're not getting any return for your investment. And ground cover values are measured in percentage ground cover. And again, all soil orders, oil land use categories, depth, well, we're just looking at surface measurements, all rainfall zone, reference condition to be determined. And we're really saying for industry, we want it to be more than 90%. Now, this is pastures, perennial, horticulture, and forestry. For cropping, we have, I think we said over 50%. Now, in cropping, that certainly wouldn't be achieved now. But we're trying to say, because we're recognizing more and more the incredible importance of ground cover in all systems, we're saying to the croppers who might be growing a monocrop of wheat or canola or whatever else, you got to come up with some strategies to improve your ground cover under these systems. Now, the scoring system. So for each of these soil properties, pH, EC, organic carbon, extractable phosphorus, and ground cover, we need to assign an indicator condition score. So we go out, we do our soil testing, we look at the result we've got, we compare it to both the ECOND reference value and the PCOND reference value, and we come up with a score. So it looks something like this. I'm just using pH here again as an example. So if it's within the reference value range for industry best practice, for example, between that 5.5 and 7.5, you get a score of 100. And similarly, we're assessing at the same time where our score lies in relation to the undisturbed pre-clearing condition. So if the pre-clearing pH range was 4.5 to 5.8, for example, and my pH is 6.5, well, I'll get 100 in my PCOND, but I will get a lower score in my ECOND. So how we have done this is we've looked at appropriate increments. So how far can we move away from our reference value range? And it's probably easier if I just talk about, because this is a PCOND, a production condition account, it's probably easier if I just talk about agricultural land and industry values as I go through the scoring system. So if we're 0.5 of a pH above or below that range, we're marked down. So the indicator condition score is only 80. If it's 0.5 to 1 above or below that range, we're moving further away from that range. We've got soil performance problems, becoming more significant if we're 0.5 to 1 of a pH above or below 5.5 to 7.5. So we get a lower score as a result. 1.5 above or below, lower score again. 1.5 to 2 above or below, lower score again. And if we're more than 2 above or below, the score is 0. So we've done the same for all of the other indicators. So in this case, organic carbon at or above reference value. So for a particular area, we might say that we want to have our organic carbon should be for a given soil type and a given land use, say 3% organic carbon. If it's less than or equal to 0.25% below that, score down. 1/4 to 0.5% below that, lower again, 1/4 to 1/2 to 3/4, 3/4 to 1%. If we're more than 1% below that reference value, so if we have an organic carbon of 1.9, we get 0. And similarly, ground cover at or above reference value, 100%. We've got just an extra step in here for ground cover because we may have less than 10% below reference value, a score of 90, 11 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 40, more than 50% below the reference value. So if our target, if we're more than 50% below our target, we get 0. So a lot of our cropping soils under this model will get 0. So there's going to be, it's really just, this is a red flashing light that says, this is an area of real concern. This is a very important indicator, and we're right out of the ballpark. We've really got to think about how we address this. And again, this is a kind of cut down version of what Karen showed you, because this is, you know, very messy on screen. So I've tried to keep this as simple as possible. The sub asset here, sorry, it's not showing, is our soil type. So if, for example, if this is our red brown earth, if it's our dermasol, whatever kind of soil we have, we're identifying it in here. Let me just get my pointer up. Okay, so in this box here, we'll be showing what kind of soil type we have. The assessment unit is a grazing pasture. So the indicators that we're using are listed here that we've been talking about. The reference benchmark, and some of these are made up for the purposes of this exercise. So we've said that the reference benchmark, which is condition before we cleared the land, us settlers, organic carbon may have been we're using expert opinion or undisturbed local resources to tell us that undisturbed soil carbon levels might be between 6 and 7 on these sites. Soil pH between these two, electrical conductivity between these two, extractable phosphorus low, and ground cover would have been, we'll say, 100%. Contrast that to the industry benchmark. So whether we're, so this is growing pasture, so we're beef growers, and the convention says on this particular soil type that we should have an organic carbon level greater than 4. We should have our pH in this level. We should have our EC less than 2 decisiemens. We should have extractable phosphorus between 23. And we should have ground cover better than 90% on grazing pastures. So we go out and we do our testing, and the test results showed a figure of 4.1 for organic carbon, a pH of 8 for pH of 8, 0.14 for electrical conductivity, 8 parts per million for phosphorus, and 95% ground cover. So the indicator condition score compared against the undisturbed pre-clearing value, well, we're way below value here against that. So we get a score of 0. We're just within range here, so we get a score of 100. We're well within range here, or comfortably within range here, we get 100. We're above range here, even though 8 from a production point of view is very low. There really was never that much freely available phosphorus in native systems. So we're above, so we're marked down there, and a little bit below on ground cover. We only get scored 90. This is comparing it against the undisturbed reference condition. When we then compare it against industry benchmark, well, the industry says we should have better than 4. We got 4.1, great, 100%. Industry says we should be between 5.5 and 7. We're at 8. We're really quite a bit outside that, so we're marked down for that. We're well within range for EC. We're quite outside range. We want to be in here between 10 and 23. We're 2 below, so we get a low score for that. And we're in good shape in terms of ground cover. We just wanted to be better than 90% against industry benchmarks. We're at 95. That gives us a score of 100. These then go through a bunch of calculations, and we get an assessment unit. What this gives us is, if you like, an average result of 74 compared against the econ, which is the undisturbed condition, and an 84 against industry best practice. I think that's it, Karen. Yep. So happy to take questions.
Thank you, Declan. I might, what I might do is, if we've got no burning questions, I think we've got quite a few in the chat, but I might go to Oscar so that he can do his presentation. And then all of us will answer questions from the chat or straight from the floor at the end. I think that's probably the way we can get through this. I've got Oscar here, so welcome, Oscar. Oscar's from the National Farmers Federation, and he's going to talk a little bit about the sustainability framework that they've been working on with the federal government. So I'm going to hand over to you, Oscar.
Thanks so much, Karen. Can everyone hear me okay? We've managed to have some floodwaters here at Moree, and the NBN has gone under, so I'm on a data network, which is a bit fragile, but can you hear me okay there?
I can hear you perfectly.
Excellent. Okay, and we can see the PowerPoint screen.
We can.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, Oscar Pearse, I'm the project manager for the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework project. That's a $4 million project, kicked off in early 2020 as part of the initiative of the Agricultural Stewardship Package, which Minister Littleproud announced in 2019, total of $34 million, with an objective of allowing agricultural industries to demonstrate their sustainability and their biodiversity and ecosystem service provisions in more robust and more commercially relevant ways. That project fits very well with NFF's 2030 roadmap. For those who aren't aware of it, NFF did one of the largest ever pieces of consultation to define this roadmap, a target towards $100 billion, and Pillar 2 is obviously an incredibly important part of that. Growing sustainably with a target of 5% of farm revenue to come from ecosystem service, as well as, of course, the carbon neutrality targets. For those policy wonks out there, you'd be aware that last year NFF upped the stakes pretty significantly, and they're now supporting a economy-wide carbon neutral 2050 target, and have been advocating very heavily in the last 18 months towards getting systems and resources and capacity and the ability for Australian agricultural producers to not only meet but beat that target. Let's just keep going. The pilot that NFF is running, the Australian Ag Sustainability Framework. Last year, we carried out a pretty substantive consultation process. Initially, our project was to create a biodiversity certification model. The problem with consultative-led approaches is that the consultation told us to do something quite significantly different. And so that's what we've done. We've followed where our consultation took us. The ANU has subsequently taken over a biodiversity certification module, and some of those activities have already been released. I think Minister Littleproud announced it last month, a series of 6 trials, a C+B program that allows farmers to participate in additional biodiversity and habitat provision, as well as carbon markets under the same project. NFF's work in 2021, we're developing a pretty wide 6-element work plan, and that'll be phase 3 pilot tested in 2022. So what are we doing? We are creating an inclusive framework, a meta standard that will allow the wide diversity of existing agricultural sustainability reporting tools and systems to be contextualized into the one place. The idea is to avoid the confusopoly, which is a bit of a term in NRM and in sustainability and ESG, but it's a particularly pertinent one for agriculture. We have a huge diversity of programs, some leading ones like Accounting for Nature, some excellent service providers like Landcare with some great systems, but we have a mess. We have no coordination, no interoperability, and no ability for a landholder to look at biodiversity, habitat provisions, or sustainability reporting as a single unified commodity. And that's essentially what we need to do. Farmers work towards commodities, they work on commodity markets, they need to be able to compare the different options, and they can't do that right now because there's no ability to compare the relative remuneration or market opportunities. So that's the principal basis for what NFF will be trying to do. Obviously, pretty significant need for collaboration, working with a range of organisations. Part of our work will be making some recommendations to the government about data and information systems that will be required to better report the sustainability outcomes on Australian lands. We're going to have a pretty wide communication process that will be starting in Q3 and 4 later in the year, as well as some quantitative surveying of essentially what I like to call the great unwashed. There's a significant number of Australian agricultural land managers who are not involved in land care, they're not involved in programs, they're managing large areas, large capital and large supply chain investments, but aren't even thinking about sustainability because they don't see market viability, and they have particular attitudes and aversions, especially towards reporting this. Part of that because of the legacy of regulatory changes over the years. So we don't aim to provide for a niche. We are providing this for the entire Australian agriculture industry. So our surveying work there will really get to the bones of what is it that the average farmer across various regions and industries thinks about and is happy to engage with when it comes to reporting sustainability. The final part, and probably the most important, is the market analysis. Show me the money. Looking at how we can get better market-based decisions in consumer and retail focused areas. We've got really strong engagement on this project from major retailers. We're looking towards the positive outcomes for farmers in terms of supply chain premiums, in terms of market access, and particularly relevant given Europe's recent changes towards ESG being a more regulated set of systems and reporting, but also the European Union's pretty significant changes in terms of market access and conditions. And we've seen that for a few years in terms of ISCC, but the trend is continuing, and access to Europe is going to require greater and greater reporting. And that's a trend across a number of developing markets. And of course, the most important thing, and probably the largest, is that broad remit of sustainability linked finance, of which natural capital and impact investment is really a subset. What are we trying to do here? So for those who are familiar, Return on Nature came out from KPMG about a year and a half ago. A number of really strong recommendations there, but the key thing is that this money is real. Sustainability linked finance is a huge potential opportunity for Australia, and an area in which we need to do significant work to meet that opportunity. The systems in place are not good enough. I suppose, and this is just tying it into some of the global scene, financing nature and the discussions coming up on the COP15 really show that there is a massive financial gap if we are to improve global biodiversity needs, but that there are viable systems for funding of land and resource management. And it's really up to individual industries and individual countries to develop the appropriate contextualization for those things. And those countries and those industries that don't will miss out. And so we see this, Australia has a huge opportunity, but it's an opportunity that will be foregone unless we can build this system and do it correctly and in time. We've done, as I said, some pretty substantive consultation. Producers and land managers in general are very interested in finding ways to monetize or find other commercial benefits to the reporting of sustainability. However, there are some pretty significant issues. We've identified those, and these are the problems that we have designed the AASF to try and solve. So cost of transaction is a major aversion factor. Confusion, duplication, the lack of the ability to reuse data in multiple areas is a major problem. The failure to recognise local context, individual industries pursuing a silo mentality. So tools and systems used in one industry are not able to be used on that same farm enterprise in other enterprises or other industries on that farm. There is a significant fear of missing out, and that's particularly true of those farmers that are involved or looking at ERF and carbon sequestration. Major concerns about privacy, profiteering, cost shifting, and of course regulatory burdens being increased. So in general, most farmers have reported to us that for them, the current status is that engaging in sustainability reporting is too hard, too confusing, not enough reward, and not seen as a proper functional market. It's seen, and we got this comment very often, a series of individual transactions as opposed to a genuine marketplace. This is a light touch on it, but I mean, look, this Dilbert cartoon sums up the current state of sustainability and ESG reporting in agriculture perfectly well. Essentially, the confusopoly is alive and well. We've had unregulated systems. We've had 1,000 flowers blooming, and that's all well and good. But at the moment, it is causing very significant problems for landholders in adoption. And yeah, I think this sums up the current state of play and what we're really trying to fix in creating the AASF. So what are we doing? Create standardized language and measurements, then use that to contextualize buyer demands in terms of 3 key areas: finance, supply chain, and conservation or sustainability programs. And obviously that top program includes everything from LRF, New South Wales BCT, private land conservation agreement areas. The supply chain is obviously diverse. There are a range of different supply chains and criteria that are required. It's fair to say in the grains industry alone, we've identified 15 different areas where there could be premiums. And unfortunately, none of them are using standardized indicators. Some use a point-in-time reporting system. Others are using non-linear points, non-linear reporting. Some have really high focus on utilising regulatory programs like the ERF and the Carbon Neutral Initiative, while others are simply asking for some very loose generic tools to be submitted. So the supply chain is a very difficult one, and it's about to be made even more difficult as we see major multinationals adopting these divergent standards and systems. However, the solution, as we see it, is it would be impossible to pull everyone into one single set of rules. It's a global market with a diversity of buyer requirements and diversity of market needs. However, if farmers can supply consistent information and control that information, its use, and have it contextualized in a relevant way, we still think we can meet those divergent requirements from various supply chain participants, but allow the farmers to replicate their information as much as possible. So the end, farmers have the ability to assess demand requirements, comparing apples with apples. They have the ability to report to those requirements in a low cost and effective manner, and they're able to participate and use finance system tools. So to do it, we've broken it down. Element 1 is being carried out by the Australian Farm Institute, a pretty significant extension of their previous work, going through and standardizing a whole heap, and I think we're up to 17 different major international systems currently, to contextualize, standardize, and prioritize the reporting through those. And that's looking at ESG, it's looking at a whole range of corporate governance reporting systems, it's looking at some of the emerging financial opportunities, as well as basic systems like SIA, ISEAL, etc. The second part is being carried out by KPMG, Show Me the Money, giving us as comprehensive as possible snapshot of what the existing commercial opportunities are right here and right now. What is it that farmers can tap into and how farmers can be remunerated? Element 3, and this is a key one, we aim to engage as many existing programs, and we've had some fantastic conversations with leaders of Accounting for Nature, with Mick Taylor I see on here as well, and a few other leading proponents of systems, as well as the existing industry programs like My Cotton BNP, the wine industry programs, rice industry, sugar industry. We're in discussions with Meat and Livestock Australia about beef industry programs and talking to some individual grain service providers as well. So a wide range of industries coming in to have their individual system ranked and reviewed according to what the framework ends up looking like, which I can't tell you because, as I said, it's underway at the moment. But report the ability for existing programs to report against those elements, and ranking and rating them on the outcome and the verification level. Element 4 is aligning those measurement frameworks against the existing programs from a demand and provisioner side. So that's where we'll be engaging with the retailers, with some of the major banks. Some banks are not interested in this program, but the majority of Australian rural lenders are, because they see this as a way to get the critical mass that's required for them to deploy some of the large scale capital funds. We're also talking to market access units from, say, Meat and Livestock Australia, as well as the Department of Agriculture's market access teams. And we'll be doing significant work on data and privacy provisions there, working with the Prime Minister's Office Data Commissioner, as well as existing industry and supply chain data systems. Element 5, the communication and engagement part, we've talked about that already, but getting out there and really getting a significant and quantitative understanding of what it is that farmers are concerned about and how is it that they would engage in this sort of a system. And final, legal and policy analysis. We've had some major issues brought up, tax law that's out of date, the treatment of certification, particularly where it's treated as a capital gains item on transactions. So that applies to a number of certificate-based sustainability transactions, and a 40% hit at the commencement of a project on capital gains is, for instance, one of our priorities in working with the tax office about some hopeful reforms to that. There's no point in farmers getting a massive tax bill or having a massive devaluation of their productive capital areas. It makes the engagement and use of sustainability reporting much more difficult and much less cost effective from a commercial point of view. What are the benefits? What we believe we can do is create a system that will allow farmers to mitigate key emerging issues. So this increasing cost of participation, increasing complexity, to manage market access challenges, to understand the new market options better, by creating an apples with apples comparison. Farmers can more easily explore what the market opportunities are. To then, once you have those base requirements for any market, but particularly for sustainability markets, to then be able to see a more full exploration and uptake of the diverse opportunity income streams that are created. And of course, enhancing farm resilience. It's a key focus for the Future Drought Fund, as well as other funding agencies like the RIC. So we're going to make sure that we've got a system that can work for those purposes, and where farmers can demonstrate the genuine improvements in farm resilience as a result of participating and reporting these different attributes. Agricultural supply chains will benefit because it will increase their opportunity to differentiate on global markets. It's fair to say that Australia's been doing the clean part of our production very well for 30 years. We've had challenges like the Helix beef market access issues. We've had increasing focus on and increasing ability to deliver systems to manage chemical residues. The clean part of what we do in Australia is very good. The green part has not been a priority and has not been as adequately dealt with. And that's not a criticism of our industry bodies, but it's certainly a reality. It is time for service providers, industry systems, and the supply chains to up their game. The commercial markets are out there. This is a way to make it more readily uptaken by producers, and then to have a lower cost for supply chains and make us more able to compete on those global markets. For buyers and consumers, and this is a key thing, consumers are even more confused than farmers. And NFF, as part of its enduring communications and monitoring of issues on agriculture, have actually seen something quite interesting. It's fair to say that the less consumers know about the specifics of agricultural production, often the happier that they are. So The consumers are also very skeptical of greenwashing. They're quite skeptical of branding. They need to see resilient and robust systems that are widely spread. There's no point continuing the idea of thousands of microsystems and confusing branding to consumers. They need universality and trust, and we believe this framework can provide that. Of course, then that allows them to have a more informed purchasing choice, and that allows them to put their dollar where they say they want agriculture to be. Of course, finally, it'd be fair to say that there hasn't been a great history on government-funded programs demonstrating a solid ROI. There's a number of reviews that have been carried out where governments have not been able to design programs in such a way that the community, the taxpayer, is able to see a clear return on investment from that expenditure on agricultural lands. We believe this framework, if applied to those systems, would actually do that, would solve the problem of not being able to get that clear demonstrated return on investment. And that would therefore be grounds for increasing, not the current trend of decreasing, government and community funding towards those activities on Australian agricultural lands, as well as, of course, all the other work that government does in mitigating future market failures and working with those international agreements. So that's where I'll leave it, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Oscar. So I am going to throw it open to questions now. So I'm going to just bring up the chat because I know there was some sitting in the chat. And if anybody else has any questions, I think the best way to manage questions at the moment might be if people can put their hand up so that we can manage people not talking over the top of each other when you all think that you've got your turn to have a question. I think that's probably the best way to do that. So that's probably that. Anyone has any questions to pop your hand up for me. I'm just going through the chat, and I know lots of people have been responding to questions directly in the chat. And I think Melanie had one around how the measurements were done for, say, canopy and sub-canopy, and I think she had ground cover as well. So for that answer, you know, when you go into the method and have a look, there's actually tools within the Accounting for Nature method that help you see how you've got to take the measurements and work out your percentages. So for example, canopy cover is taking 30 steps across your transect that you've set up with your photo points and ticking a box that says, yes, there's canopy cover, yes, there's sub-canopy cover, there's no shrubs. And so you do that all the way for 30 steps and then obviously average up your score out of that and then turn that into a percentage. So that's all there. Ground cover is also on there as well. There's a matrix which has like little pixels, if you like, in little square boxes, and the more pixels there are, the greater ground cover it represents. So you're just doing a comparison between what you see on the ground and which pixelated box it might match up with on the method, and then that tells you which percentage score to give the ground cover. So you just match it up that way. So there's lots of visual cues to help you work out some of those estimates, if you like. So does anybody else have a question? Rowan, I might get you to help me manage any questions that are coming through as well. That would be easier.
I suppose I've just got a quick comment, and thanks, Oscar, for that great presentation. One of them's around the ability to compare apples with apples. And I think that's what initially got us pretty excited about the Accounting for Nature as one of those confusopoly methods, is its ability to index a whole variety of different methods, from productive landscapes to environmental assets on their own, but also different things from Queensland down to the highlands of Tassie. By having an indexed way of looking at it, you just come out with a nice simple score that says good or bad to the producer, but it also can be scaled right up at a national level to say good or bad. And that effectively means you can be comparing apples with oranges through a bunch of different methods with the same thing, which is the whole point of that market, which we're pretty excited to see established so that we can see that return on investment and, as you say, increase the amount of funding that goes to good stewards across the landscape.
Yeah, and I think, look, it'd be fair to say that if I was to pick a winner, just between friends, and don't tell the other industry program managers this, but I mean, Accounting for Nature is very strong on its on the robustness of its methodologies. It's very strong on its ability to do that, to contextualize. I would say that I think we're looking a little bit broader. In recognition of where current global supply chains are, I'd say that Accounting for Nature is a premium end product, and that there are other commercial systems out there that are a lot less robust. The demands are a lot lower. The reporting and verification levels are much lower, and we have to recognise that diversity of market demands. So there are industries, supply chains who are taking quite low level, producer self-declaration, stat decks, not even required. And yet there is a discrete sustainability premium for some reporting some of those attributes. So I would say that Accounting for Nature is within the spectrum, a high level program with a high value response potentially. We are, NFF's job is to not pick favourites, to look at the full diversity and to include some of those lower level, less robust programs, because that is still a commercial driver that's, in the real, in the here and now. I guess the other thing is, as part of our project, and I can see a really strong opportunity there, is potentially, certain industry programs have worked very well, have linked up to the commercial demands for their discrete and existing supply chains. But they are aware that those demands are changing. And I can certainly see, as Accounting for Nature have picked up the ability to modulise certain, particularly the tier 4 and 5 modules, there could be some really solid partnerships there between existing industry QA programs or BMPs and Accounting for Nature to meet those gaps where they are present in that specific supply chain or industry. So, pairing Accounting for Nature with other parts of existing industry QA programs may be part of what we end up coming as an output of this program. So adding the robustness and filling the gaps that are in existing industry systems. I'm a grain producer. The grains industry really is a long way behind other industries, it's fair to say. We don't have universal QA systems. We still use stat decks from the beef industry, for instance, when we're talking about chemical residue, and yet we're trying to tap into high-value European and Japanese markets. We need to do a lot of work in the grains industry, and it would be foolish to create new systems and tools that would simply be duplicating existing opportunities. So there's a lot of industries that will need to understand the market demand drivers better, and then it would be very logical to pick up existing systems and integrate them into their own. So that's one of the strengths I see for Accounting for Nature. That said, as I said at the beginning, there are some low-level premiums, low-level supply chain demands, and we don't want to add additional costs and additional complexity if farmers are not going to be realising additional benefits. If what they're doing now is good enough, then that's what they'll continue to do.
I think that good enough message has been coming through from a whole bunch of different areas, from investment through to the people on the ground, that high levels not what's needed, and something that's meaningful enough is really the key to get this started. What do you reckon about that?
Absolutely. Getting a foot in the door. I mean, what I didn't mention is part of element 3 will also be remote sensing tools. There will be farmers that we think can utilise and participate in the framework without any form of certification. They may be able to use remote sensing data and their own farm records and still be able to meet a demonstrated market need. There'll be a progression, and that's been the historical issues. I think it's fair to say, and this isn't talking about Accounting for Nature, or I won't be too specific, but it's fair to say that historically, this has been led by, let's do the science, let's work out what best practice is, and then let's not think about the market demands until the end point. We've got the market demand drivers as element 2 because it needs to lead it. If there isn't a commercial driver or a significant commercial or market access opportunity, we don't intend to put it in. If that changes later down the track, then yes, something comes in. But attributes need to be led by the dollars. Agriculture is a commercial industry, and if you design something on the science and then take it to market, you will fail, because that's been what's happening in Australian agriculture for 30 years now. Find what the market demands are and meet those at the specification they've asked for is our principle here. That said, individual programs can overshoot the mark, and it can still be, profitable for those farmers to engage in it. So
yeah.
We're not.
There's a good example of that already in Queensland with the LRF and linking the co-benefits of biodiversity through to carbon farming. So it's already becoming an expectation. So what we're keen to support carrot over stick for producers in particular, and help reward that good behaviour. But it's the two are going to go hand in hand. And it's going to come whether or not there's a market. There'll also be an expectation. And that goes back to your return on investment comment, I suppose, doesn't it? Being able to demonstrate you've actually done what you said.
Yeah, and look, it will be progressive. There is a very clear trend line globally: finance markets, supply chains, increasing requirements. Farmers have often resisted that politically, especially within agro-political discussions. But I think, we've got a current ag minister who's firmly of the same view. Let's get the tools, let's get the systems, let's meet those market demands. His C+B program, like the LRF in Queensland, allowing farmers to get both a discrete carbon and biodiversity income stream. That's the trend that we've got to keep continuing along, allowing, and I've got to say, this was the number one thing in our consultation, was that farmers want to be able to reuse their data, reuse their record keeping. They know, they've done the numbers, individual programs or systems don't provide a commercial market return often. So the only way to do it is to reuse your system, reuse your data. It's not getting paid twice. It's getting paid for the individual discrete characteristics that you're producing. That's a critical thing, and that cumulative net benefit, we believe, and especially increasingly so, will make reporting sustainability more and more commercially viable, and so there'll be more and more pull through from farmers to pick up these tools.
All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, you two. I'm going to hand over to a couple of other questions that are coming through. So Ron, I'll get to yours in a second. I've got one here on the chat from Julie that just says, what time of the year is best to measure? So I think Rowan and I can probably answer for the environmental, and I'll let Declan answer for soils. So in terms of environmental, I don't think it matters greatly. The key here is to make sure that you're monitoring at the same time each year if you're doing annual measurements. Obviously, you don't want to do it spring one year and winter or summer the following year. So certainly pick the same season and the same month if possible, so that you've got that consistency to your data. And likewise, you don't want to go out and spray your assessment area, knock out all the weeds, and then take an assessment because it bumps your score up. So you do want to get an idea of where your assessment area is in reality, but just make sure that you're measuring at the same time each year. So I'll just, Declan, have you got a quick answer for soils? And then I'll throw to Ron, who's also got a question.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you said, Karen. It's consistency that's most important. Ideal times to measure would be autumn or spring. For people in low rainfall areas, there's often a general prescription to assess ground cover at the toughest time of the year, because that's going to identify, the vulnerable period, and that might be if you're a Mallee or in Southeast New South Wales or South Australia, measuring your ground cover over summer is going to tell you when you've kind of got the biggest challenge and then how you need to respond to that.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to throw to you, Ron. You got a question?
No, you answered exactly right. It's the whole point is to pull out trends over time. So if you hit your weeds in year one and measure a month after that when they've got no weeds, and you're not doing that year on year, you're going to see that trend actually make you look bad. So make sure that if you are going year on year and you have a regular weed program that precedes it, then that's okay to be consistent along those lines. But Really, it doesn't matter. The aim is consistency. And if you're seeing those degradation over time, you can be putting comments in through the accounting for nature method to address why there's been a decline in year 2 because you didn't do your weed management. But that's the whole point, is to tease out good management and see that that's turning into improvements in condition and extent.
Well, thanks, Ron. Rod, your question?
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused about how you use these tools at a whole of property basis. So the econ seems to be useful in the bush areas, and the pecon is usable in the non-bush areas. So at a property level, should we be combining these, or should we be saying, is there a metric that says 20% of the property should be bush and the other 80% can be productive? Is there some way of joining these together rather than using them as separate tools?
I'm going to hand to you, Rowan, to answer that one.
Essentially, no, because you're measuring different things. You're measuring a productive area and you're measuring an environmental asset area. And so it's in the accounts, it will all come down to an area and a score. So in that sense, they do stack, but you are going out and looking to do different things because one, there's a different benchmark and there's a different ideal for both of those states. So
I guess
if you had a whole of property map, then you would have your different areas and you'd do 1, 2, 3 surveys here of your bush block and then 1, 2, 3 of your productive paddocks. Obviously the numbers will change, but it's important to recognise that they are different, but they all feed into that overall plan. In terms of how much of your property should be protected or managed for native vegetation versus productive areas, that's going to vary obviously by where you sit in the landscape, where you see your property going, what the topology is, and the type of production that you have on your farm as well.
And I guess it also is related back to what type of markets or what purpose you're actually doing the accounting for. So some people may not want to do both the productive capacity and the native veg capacity. There might be just one of those in particular that you want to focus on for now. So you might only be measuring your econ or you might only be measuring your pecon for now, depending on what the purpose of why you're doing this is. And likewise, if you're aiming towards going in for a certain market incentive in the future, whether that is biodiversity or carbon or something around those sorts of things, that's going to determine too which one you use or both.
The other point that I'd add to that, Karen, is these systems, they change slowly. So I don't want people to think that they have necessarily to go out there every year and carry out these assessments. You can. If you've got, say, a newly established biodiversity block, that's going to be changing quite quickly. So it might be useful to see how that's changing year on year. But if you've got an established biodiversity block, and similarly, if you've got established perennial farmland, you may be looking at soil testing every 5 years, because testing at frequencies higher than that, you may not see any real change. So just bear in mind that we're looking at trend over time, and we may be looking at 3 to 5 year revisits to establish those trends.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ron. I've got a question here from Ellen, which I'm going to read out, and it probably requires a multi-response as well from presenters. Is a dollar value attributed to any of the results obtained from these measures other than the incentive payments to producers? And can we expect a higher econ score would lead automatically to a higher pecon score over time? So that's probably a question there for you, Declan. And the first part, maybe Rowan or Oscar could answer that one in terms of the dollar value on these measures.
Yeah, I think that talks directly to Oscar's point about putting the method before a market. So currently there isn't a dollar value, and a point of this pilot is really to start looking at what that could look like, but making sure that the method's something that's usable on the ground. And so we know that the market's in development and very close through a number of mechanisms, but it's not there. A dollar value will help drive this a very long way. So be that incentive payments from the federal government through to rate discounts to a local council, through to impact investment level sorts of things. There's no dollar, but that's where we want it to head. And having that consistency and that transparency around it will give the confidence to the market. So, but I'll let Oscar finish that off, I think. Probably.
Oscar may have gone.
I lost
I
him.
have to check the. I think you've suitably answered it anyway, Rowan.
Well,
And so, Declan, yep.
I'll give you a quick answer on the.
Mhm.
Look, the short answer is not necessarily. As I was saying, a higher econ score might represent, conditions that were closer to original, but bear in mind that we're purposefully changing soil conditions from original to make them more suited to the foreign plants that we want to grow now. So a higher econ score might mean that we're moving away in some respects from ideal growing conditions. If the higher econ score means higher soil carbon, well, then that's also going to be good for pecan. But if a higher econ score means low phosphorus, then that's not going to be good for a pecan.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I think we have gone through most of the comments, and lots of them are just comments, and we've either answered them in the chat or I don't think anybody's got their hand up right now. So oh, Ellen's got her hand up again. Lucky I can see her. Yeah, have you got another question, Ellen?
Just to follow on from that, I realised that I actually meant did the higher econ score in the plant cover or the native vegetation cover lead to the higher pecan score in the agricultural sense, and thinking there that if we've got a higher econ score, then that's likely to mean that that really higher biodiversity should lead eventually to higher production. Just
I think there's something in that, Ellen. If our vegetation areas on a farm are scoring high on econ, they're in good condition. There's good biodiversity in there, and a lot of the time these places are really important biodiversity harbours for pest and disease control, which then is reflected in the crop. So I would say generally, if your native vegetation is in very good condition, it's going to augur well for your productive land. Back to you, Karen.
Thank you.
I could just add to that, Karen. There's a whole lot of co-benefits that we know from managing environmental areas on farms, from evapotranspiration rates to, as you say, pest management. We haven't put the links together, and the timelines around how that would work also hasn't been looked into. But this is the whole point of the benchmarking, getting these baseline assessments, and ideally bringing in all of that hard work that's been done in previous years through other projects, like Oscar pointed to. Is we want this to be translatable, and so the more of this we can have and show, the better links we'll be able to put towards those co-benefits from productive and environmental assets working together.
Cool. Thanks, Rowan. So we've got a question here just from Julie. Is there a link to the photo point instructions? Julie, they're in the method. I think we've popped the links to the Accounting for Nature methods on their webpage in the chat there. Just copy that link, and that'll take you into the method. You just look up the native vegetation method for Victoria. So make sure you go to the Victoria stuff, and the photo point instructions are in there with a diagram, and so are all the other instructions on how to conduct your field measurements. And so just on that, I guess, to wrap up, I just wanted to thank the landholders that humoured us coming out to trial this method and actually see how it worked on the ground and how we could improve it before it became public on the Accounting for Nature website, and also make sure that it was user friendly and that we could muddle around with some of the econ scoring and things like that. So we've ironed out as many kinks as we can find so far, and I would certainly love to have a small group of producers somewhere else in the region. I've got some already for the Mornington Peninsula, but elsewhere, just again to sit down and go through it, show others how to use it, how to do the field measurements, get your reference benchmarking data, and make sure that we have fully found all of the kinks in the Accounting for Nature methodology before it sort of gets sent around for everybody to be utilising. So I think that's a really good way for us to be able to feed that information back to Accounting for Nature, and they've been really good so far with updating the things that we've picked out that were not working very well. So that's been awesome. So yeah, I do definitely want to thank the landholders that have been involved in helping us to do this trialling of the method. I think that's pretty much it for everybody. So thank you very much for coming along. Like I said, anybody that would like to be involved in a small group, just send me an email, and I'll put that together over the coming weeks. If anybody is interested in joining the one down at the Mornington Peninsula, I might be able to squeeze 1 or 2 people in. It is already sort of, I guess, probably fully committed. but I'm happy to squeeze 1 or 2 people in if they want to come down to check out Barragunda. And we'll be spending a couple of hours down there on that farm doing the reference benchmarking in the shed, and then we'll guide into that massive patch of native vegetation and set up one of the photo points and do that. So thank you very much for attending. This has been recorded, so I will make it available afterwards. I'll make the presentations available afterwards, and I'll have all your contact details. So I'll send it around afterwards once we've downloaded it all. So thank you very much for coming along, and I hope you got something out of it.
Thanks, everybody.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Mick, Rowan and Declan, did you want to stay on board afterwards?